Oh, right. Okay. I'm delighted to be here, and even though I don't see the... Here we are, yeah, here we are. Here's the title slide. So yes, I'm going to be talking about, and the P has gone missing somewhere, the GRRIP interventions and shaping the action plans, action plan template. So very important component parts of what we've been doing in the GRRIP project. You're familiar already with the GRRIP partners, both the division between the case study sites who have been implementing various actions, of course, to try and introduce different aspects of RRI within their organizations, and you're already aware of the range of other organizations that have taken other parts within the project. Right, just to give a little bit of context, we are, well, to begin with, at the outset of the project, before I actually joined the project, there were reviews of 14 different RRI projects to understand how issues for change were addressed by them, and we're talking about cultural change and practical changes that related to RRA interventions. And so that gave us, obviously, or gave the project members knowledge of different approaches that have succeeded or not succeeded so well in different projects. And out of that was developed, if you like, that fundamental foundation baseline kind of document, which templates set out by the sites, by the 5 sites, to provide a framework for the selected interventions that they would attempt to put in place in their organizations. And those action plans also identified the timescales or milestones against which progress could be monitored for the activities concerned. Now, the templates were then completed. I shall go into this in a bit more detail, by the way. But the templates were then completed by each site to enable monitoring of the progress to take place at various times. And this presentation focuses first on the interventions themselves, and secondly on the action plan templates. And both of these carry importance for the GRRIP project, of course, enabling or facilitating the documentation of progress, identification of barriers, and how these barriers were addressed, or the challenges were addressed. So starting, first of all, with the interventions. Determinations were made at an early stage of the project regarding the interventions relevant to each of the RRI pillars, and which could have general applicability. So all of the 5 sites were looking at similar kinds of interventions, although in fact there was some flexibility to bend them according to their particular needs. And 72 interventions or actions were used to make those selections for the 5 sites, based on the intent that had been set out in the original grant agreement for the project, baseline assessment results, and we've already had an indication of how some of those baseline assessments came about, and also the outcomes of the project reviews that had taken place for other projects as well. And it's important to note that the interventions related to 6 broader goals. Building institutional leadership and support leadership, I think, is already coming through as a theme for this particular work. Embedding RRI in the institutional governance framework, again, something that already has arisen. Developing institutional knowledge, skills and awareness of RRI right across the organization, something of a challenge has already been pointed to. And establishing structures to facilitate sustainable engagement with different societal stakeholders, embedding RRI in science, technology and innovation systems and funding proposals, and reflecting and analysing the RRI implementation process. So 6 broad goals within which the interventions can be considered. Right, the sites then decided which interventions they would pursue in the light of the audits undertaken, which, as we've seen already, gave an indication of their levels of maturity for each of the pillars, and therefore signalling any shortcomings. Also taking account of the range of current activities relevant to potential interventions and which might be built on. And I think one of the messages this morning has been not forgetting that RRI isn't totally new. There will be all kinds of things that were going on in organizations foundations which could have been built on or were built on, and which is relevant to the success of the interventions later. And of course, they needed to take into account the constraints of the project timescale, within which measurable and meaningful changes might be achieved. And for and to help the organisations, a framework or action plan template was provided for the sites so that they could all specify why they selected particular interventions, who would be responsible for them, what steps were going to be taken in order to pursue those interventions, what criteria, what success criteria should apply, what milestones should also apply to facilitate the monitoring of those interventions, and also to identify at that stage what they saw as some of the key challenges and what plans they might have for managing the risks that they might encounter. So a very, very important phase of the project, therefore, in selecting the interventions. Now, I'm just going to give you a small sample of different interventions, just to give you a bit more of a taster. This one here is in relation to governance, which, if selected by the sites, required them to identify and ensure representation on the GRRIP working group from key institutional functions and departments, as well as the top middle management and researchers for implementing RRI. So making sure the right people were involved, the working groups involved, in order to carry things forward. And this, of course, fits with the broader goal, which I mentioned earlier, of building institutional leadership and support, and crucial, therefore, to the success of specific interventions relating to different pillars as well. Governance, of course, and ethics can be seen as a somewhat broader keys or pillars compared to the other ones around, for instance, public engagement. Here's a specific one here, where the approach taken by the sites clearly broadened out beyond the triple helix concerned with academia, industry and government, and recognised the wider reality around responsibility towards the communities in which they operated and the sustainability of the communities and the organisations themselves. So with regard to public engagement, there's a couple of interventions here. To establish the mechanisms to track collaborations to demonstrate the triple helix and or quadruple helix models of research and innovation. The quadruple helix being that which is concerned with the broader involvement of a broader range of stakeholders, including the public. And again, leveraging existing collaborations and extending strategic stakeholder networks with different societal actors. So again, building on what was already in place, as well as extending things into new areas. Another one here concerned with gender equality, very strong for some of the partners here in terms of their eagerness and energy they put into developing or working on interventions that related to this particular pillar. A very, very simple, if you like, or straightforward. I say simple, it wasn't simple because the detail is obviously important here. But in terms of a simple statement here, the need for one of the interventions to be the development of a gender equality plan, and then clearly another intervention introducing structures and policies to embed gender balance in institutional research and innovation decision making. So offering both the framework and a context for the introduction of specific actions by the sites reflected in milestones which would be used to monitor progress for the different interventions. And just something that really cut across, I mean, this is only a sample here, but one thing that did definitely cut across the different RRI pillars was the issue of training, because quite clearly all the sites recognised that greater awareness was necessary amongst staff at all levels, and so therefore all of them addressed training challenges in different kinds of ways. Conveying knowledge seen as hugely important, fostering people's commitment to RRI, motivating staff in relation to the selected interventions. So moving on quite briefly to just give an indication of the action plan's template. I know you can't possibly read this, but the main points are, if you had the time to dig into this and look a bit more closely, the whole point of these action plans, or the template I should say, was to make sure that the sites were clear about the interventions that they had selected and how those interventions related to a particular problem or challenge that they saw as relevant for their organisation. It also enabled them to set out who indeed owned responsibility for driving forward on that intervention. and it set out the plan for implementation and explained the plan for implementation by them. And importantly, certainly more importantly from my personal point of view, because of my involvement in the project at a slightly later stage, was that this particular template set out milestones which would help in the monitoring process using monitoring sheets that were prepared, which looked something like this. Now, again, you can't see the detail, but the essential point to recognize is that there is a number of columns here, and to the right you see 2 milestones, and some of the interventions had up to 7 milestones. 1 or 2 of them only had 1 milestone, and so obviously this matrix could be extended, or was extended, for different sites in order to accommodate the information that was required for each of the different interventions. You can see that, you can just about see that in this matrix there is a planned date for completion, which relates to the milestone threshold, if you like. There are targets that actually relate as well to each of those milestones. And they determine the extent to which at that time the interventions had been successful and therefore were acceptable, or had been less successful, in which case maybe unacceptable or regarded as poor. And indeed, in some cases where the targets had been exceeded, in which case they became outstanding or excellent. But perhaps the most interesting thing on this particular matrix is the horizontal lines towards the bottom there, which is picked out in red, or partly in red, and which relate to the dates, the specific dates at which the monitoring took place. So that in sequence, going horizontally down those 3 rows, you can see how progress was made in relation to the different milestones as to whether or not the milestone had been met, i.e. the target reached in the timescale set, or whether it hadn't been met, whether it was met by the next time threshold, and so forth. And this was the basis on which assessments have been made regarding the progress or the rate of progress towards the targets and towards meeting the milestones for each of the interventions for each of the sites as well. And the only other thing just to mention on this is to say that there is, of course, the scope for other information. It's not all quantitative. Clearly, we wanted to understand some of the challenges and how those challenges were overcome, and indeed if there were delays or certain issues were placed on hold. And it's true to say as well, I think this comes up on one of the later slides, that occasionally some of the milestones were seen as, or interventions were seen as unachievable, and therefore required amendments to the action plans themselves. So coming towards the end here, there's some key learnings that come out of this process. One of the obvious things is that clear and well thought out interventions are definitely a crucial requirement at the outset, deciding what interventions should be pursued and why they are being pursued. And the action plan template completion was clearly a key task performed by the different sites to enable monitoring of progress, both by the sites themselves for their own interventions and, of course, for the project as a whole, and identifying the successes, barriers, slippage, using the monitoring sheets as well to give pointers, and giving pointers to where changes might be needed to the action plan. The format, the template format, I think was appropriate, and it is potentially able to be used or tailored for use by other projects concerned with RRI pillars, or indeed other responsibility objectives for different sectors. And the overall lessons, I think, are the need for templates to be in place at the project outset, and also to recognise a point that has been made today already, that apparent progress, you can't see it all in just numbers, because very often changes to the action plans were necessitated. In other words, the template is a tool that makes sure there are clear understandings around the interventions and that the basis is in place for the monitoring of progress, but an overall perspective needs to be maintained that acknowledges the extent to which the sites were responsive to the challenges they encountered, and therefore adjusted their approaches in order to make the progress desired. Thank you very much.